By the early 1980s, the Philadelphia Mafia wasn't at war with New York. It was at war with itself. Federal wiretaps would later reveal a single voice behind the bloodshed: cold, impatient, absolute. Nicodemo Nicky Scarfo didn't just order murders, he normalized them. Between 1981 and 1986, more than 20 men connected to the Philadelphia crime family were killed, many of them insiders. Some were shot in public, others vanished. A few were executed over suspicions alone. Other mobsters had ruled through tradition. Scarfo ruled through fear. And by the time the violence stopped, the Mafia in Philadelphia would never recover.
Nicodemo Scarfo Jr. was born in 1929 into a neighborhood where organized crime wasn't myth, it was infrastructure. His uncle, Salvatore Cockeyed Sal Scarfo, was already connected to the local mafia hierarchy. By his early 20s, Scarfo had earned a reputation for being quiet, intense, and unusually quick to violence. Unlike flashier gangsters, Scarfo didn't seek admiration, he sought control. In 1957, he was implicated in his first confirmed killing, shot during a diner confrontation. It wasn't impulsive, it was surgical. Scarfo served time, and prison didn't soften him. It refined him.
When Scarfo returned to the streets, he found opportunity in Atlantic City, a city on the brink of legal gambling and massive cash flow. As a capo underboss Angelo Bruno, Scarfo ran crews that handled loan sharking, extortion, and enforcement. But even then, other mobsters noticed something unsettling. Scarfo didn't argue. He didn't negotiate. He eliminated. While Bruno favored diplomacy, Scarfo believed mercy created weakness. That ideological divide would soon explode, reshaping the entire crime family.
Angelo Bruno was murdered execution style while sitting in his car. The hit shattered decades of mafia stability in Philadelphia. Though Scarfo denied direct involvement, law enforcement immediately suspected his faction benefited the most. Within a year, Scarfo would rise to boss. What followed wasn't consolidation, it was purge. Associates, capos, even loyal soldiers began disappearing. Some mobsters later testified they feared Scarfo more than prison. The reign of fear had officially begun. When Nicky Scarfo officially became boss of the Philadelphia crime family in 1981, he didn't inherit loyalty, he inherited skepticism. Several senior members believed Scarfo was too volatile, too reckless, too eager to use violence where negotiation once worked. In mafia culture, that doubt was dangerous, especially when the boss believed hesitation was betrayal. Scarfo's response was simple: remove uncertainty. Within months, men suspected of disloyalty were marked. Some were longtime associates. Others had done nothing more than ask questions. Under Scarfo, suspicion alone became a death sentence. This wasn't chaos. It was policy.
Scarfo's leadership style stunned even seasoned mobsters. Hits were ordered not after prolonged disputes, but after brief conversations. According to later testimony, Scarfo believed fear was more reliable than respect and faster than diplomacy. One former associate told federal investigators, "Under Scarfo, nobody felt safe, not even the people doing the killing." Bodies began turning up across South Philadelphia and New Jersey. Some victims were shot in public. Others were lured to meetings they never returned from. The message was unmistakable: survive by obedience, die by doubt.
Scarfo didn't just demand loyalty, he tested it. Associates were ordered to participate in murders, not because they had to, but because Scarfo wanted to know who would cross the line. Refusal wasn't an option. Hesitation was remembered. This tactic fractured the family. Men feared Scarfo, but they also feared one another. Informants later described a climate where paranoia fed paranoia. Trust disappeared. Meetings grew smaller. Silence became survival. Ironically, Scarfo's obsession with control began weakening the very organization he sought to dominate.
Nowhere felt Scarfo's rule more intensely than Atlantic City. Once seen as a golden opportunity for organized crime, the city became a killing ground as Scarfo targeted anyone he believed threatened his control of gambling and construction rackets. Murders tied to Scarfo's faction drew intense federal attention. The FBI expanded wiretaps, surveillance increased. Prosecutors began building cases not just on individual crimes, but on Scarfo's pattern of leadership through violence. By the mid-1980s, law enforcement wasn't asking if Scarfo would fall. They were asking how many people would die before he did.
By 1983, Scarfo's greatest threat wasn't rival families or federal agents. It was his own people. Meetings became rare. Conversations were guarded. Mobsters began carrying weapons even when summoned by Scarfo himself. According to later testimony, some believed Scarfo deliberately spread rumors to see who would panic and who would report back. This atmosphere created exactly what Scarfo feared most: instability. And instability, in his mind, demanded blood. Salvatore "Salvi" Testa was young, respected, and powerful, the son of former underboss Philip Testa. To many in the family, he represented the future. To Scarfo, he represented a problem. On March 14, 1984, Testa was ambushed and shot to death in South Philadelphia. The murder shocked the mafia world. Killing Testa wasn't strategic, it was personal. Even hardened mobsters later testified that this was the moment they realized Scarfo would eliminate anyone, regardless of pedigree.
After Testa's murder, something unprecedented happened. Men began talking, not openly, but quietly. Some fled. Others approached federal authorities. Scarfo's obsession with loyalty had backfired. The very fear he cultivated pushed insiders toward cooperation. Wiretaps multiplied. Surveillance logs thickened. Prosecutors now had something rare: multiple witnesses describing the same pattern of leadership by murder. Scarfo still believed fear would protect him. The government believed fear would undo him.
Scarfo's own nephew and underboss, Philip Leonetti, became increasingly disturbed by the violence. Leonetti had carried out killings on Scarfo's orders, but by the mid-1980s, he believed the boss had lost control. According to later court testimony, Leonetti feared Scarfo might eventually order his death. In a mafia culture built on blood ties, this was unthinkable. It was also inevitable.
By 1986, the Philadelphia crime family was bleeding informants. Federal prosecutors began assembling a RICO case that didn't focus on isolated murders, but on Scarfo himself as the engine behind them. The strategy was clear: don't prove every killing, prove the system. Scarfo was still free, still ordering violence, but the endgame had begun.
By 1986, the fear inside the Philadelphia crime family had reached a breaking point. Philip Leonetti, Scarfo's nephew, underboss, and most trusted enforcer, had spent years carrying out his uncle's orders. He had witnessed the executions. He had delivered the messages, and he had watched Scarfo's paranoia intensify with every perceived slight. According to later testimony, Leonetti came to believe Scarfo no longer distinguished between enemies and allies. Decisions were driven less by strategy than by suspicion. Men were killed not for disobedience, but for imagined betrayal. Even blood ties, once sacred in mafia culture, no longer guaranteed safety. Leonetti understood something critical. Scarfo's system could not sustain itself, and if it collapsed, it would collapse violently. Quietly, without warning anyone inside the organization, Leonetti contacted federal authorities. For prosecutors, it was a breakthrough years in the making. For the mafia, it was an earthquake. The silence Scarfo enforced through fear had finally been broken. Leonetti's cooperation transformed rumor into record. For the first time, investigators could map Scarfo's reign as a system, how meetings were structured, how suspicions were seeded, how murders were approved, delegated, and enforced. Leonetti described an organization where violence wasn't reactive but preventative. Kill first, Scarfo believed, and resistance disappears. Testimony revealed how Scarfo used murder as a management tool. Associates were ordered to participate not simply to eliminate targets, but to bind them through shared guilt. Refusal was remembered. Hesitation was punished. Survival depended on proving absolute obedience. Federal prosecutors now saw the broader picture. This wasn't a collection of crimes. It was an enterprise governed by fear, maintained through systematic killing, and led by a single authority. Scarfo had always believed terror ensured loyalty. In court, that same terror became corroboration. Every execution left a witness. Every order left a trail.
In January 1988, federal agents moved in. When Nicky Scarfo was arrested, it wasn't for a single murder or isolated charge. He was indicted under the Racketeer Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act, RICO, accused of running a criminal enterprise defined by violence. For a man who had ruled absolutely, the moment was disorienting. Scarfo had survived prison before. He had beaten cases. He believed fear insulated him from consequences. But this time, the case wasn't built on one witness or one incident. It was built on pattern. The government alleged Scarfo personally authorized murders, cultivated paranoia, and dismantled his own organization through relentless bloodshed. The boss who once dictated life and death was now processed like any other defendant, handcuffed, silent, controlled. The empire Scarfo built through fear no longer answered to him.
Inside the courtroom, Scarfo's world unraveled. Jurors listened as former allies described the murders they committed or narrowly escaped. Wiretapped conversations revealed a boss obsessed with control, distrustful of everyone, convinced betrayal was inevitable. Prosecutors didn't need to prove Scarfo pulled a trigger. They only needed to prove he ordered the system. And they did. Scarfo sat through testimony detailing executions he authorized, men he marked, and families he destabilized. The secrecy he relied on for decades now worked against him. The more tightly he had controlled information, the clearer the hierarchy appeared. Fear, once his greatest weapon, had become his clearest signature. By the end of the trial, it was no longer a question of whether Scarfo was violent. It was whether violence was the only language he ever used.
In 1989, Nicodemo Nicky Scarfo was sentenced to life in federal prison. There was no dramatic outburst, no apology, no acknowledgement. For a man who ruled through intimidation, the ending was quiet and final. Scarfo would never walk free again. The Philadelphia Mafia, once structured and profitable, never recovered. Leadership was decimated, trust was gone. Law enforcement pressure remained relentless. Scarfo's reign had not strengthened the family, it had hollowed it out. In the end, Scarfo proved something mafia leaders had long denied. Fear can enforce obedience, but it cannot sustain power. His legacy wasn't an empire, it was a warning.
After Scarfo's conviction, comparisons were inevitable. American Mafia history had seen violence before. Albert Anastasia in New York, Carmine Galante, and others who ruled through intimidation. But investigators and historians noted a distinction. Those bosses used violence strategically, often to protect revenue or territory. Scarfo's violence was different. Former law enforcement officials described it as internalized. Much of it targeted his own organization. Men were killed not to expand power, but to preserve Scarfo's sense of control. Loyalty was never secure.
respect was never sufficient. In that sense, Scarfo didn't just eliminate rivals, he destabilized his own foundation. Even mobsters accustomed to brutality later testified that Scarfo went too far, not because of the number of murders alone, but because of how casually they were ordered. The violence wasn't episodic, it was constant.
Atlantic City never returned to what it was in the early 1980s. Once a booming hub of organized crime influence, the city became a focal point for federal investigations after Scarfo's downfall. Construction rackets collapsed, gambling interests fragmented, informants replaced enforcers. Scarfo's reign had drawn too much attention, too many bodies, too many witnesses. What was once discreet became exposed. Law enforcement officials later noted that Scarfo's leadership accelerated the decline of mafia power in the region by decades. Where secrecy once protected operations, paranoia destroyed them. The casinos survived. The crime family did not.
Behind bars, Scarfo's authority evaporated. He was no longer issuing orders, no longer feared, no longer relevant. In prison, hierarchy was replaced by routine, and reputation meant little beyond the walls he once controlled. Former associates moved on, or testified. The organization he once ruled continued to fracture. Scarfo, who had believed fear ensured immortality, faced the reality that power without loyalty leaves nothing behind. He remained defiant until the end. But defiance does not equal influence.
The Philadelphia crime family never recovered its former stature. After Scarfo, leadership was weak, fragmented, and constantly surveilled. Recruitment slowed. Trust vanished. The blueprint Scarfo left behind wasn't one of dominance, but dysfunction. Historians now point to his reign as a case study in how fear-based leadership accelerates collapse. Scarfo didn't fall because the mafia failed him. He fell because he dismantled it himself.
Nicodemo Nicky Scarfo didn't just rule through violence, he believed in it. And for a time, it worked. But fear has limits. It silences allies, it breeds betrayal, and eventually, it leaves no one willing to protect you. Scarfo's story isn't just about organized crime. It's about leadership with restraint, and the cost of confusing control with strength. In the end, Scarfo wasn't undone by rivals or ambition. He was undone by the very weapon he trusted most.